Japanese fashion is an enigma. For many of you, it's an untouchable prospect, and for as small as the world is, due to the internet, getting into Japanese fashion, you might as well be living on Mars. Which is cool, except for the fact it's still criminally underrated because of that fact. What's up everybody, I'm Reggie Casual, and today we talk about why Japanese fashion is still underrated and the brands that showcase exactly why we probably should be paying more attention. That's the take, and of course, this is the intro. Since its discovery by Westerners who were not going back and forth to Japan every waking minute, Japanese fashion as a whole has always had this cool from afar label placed on it. While in the West, we had always enjoyed a healthy dose of trends, celebrity endorsements, and currently influencer-driven movements, Japan had seemed to operate on a completely different wavelength. Westerners clearly saw in Japanese fashion quality, experimentation, and precision that was apparently lacking in a lot of Western fashion. The Japanese weren't just wearing clothes, they were owning looks. The brands were focused and made well, and even the more experimental were given a platform, or at least a chance. It might be even crazier to say that Japanese fashion seemed freer than in the West, which is nuts if you think about it. But this fashion bravery in Japan came at a cost, in a way. The minute Japanese fashion had a bigger eye on it from the West, particularly from the American perspective, it became competitive, as fashion and style often do. And I'll be the first to say that this is a foreign idea to most Japanese when it comes to fashion. Like, why are we competing though? Just wear what you want, right? Well, because Japanese fashion couldn't be obtained by the Western market easily, it was eventually criticized, but not for being unavailable, but for being a diffusion of Western styles, a common argument that you might hear from the Western perspective. They only do what we do, and we moved on from that. And this is where we get into the origins of Japanese fashion being underrated, because it undeniably takes inspiration from the West in a lot of cases. But it's not just the United States, it's French, it's Italian, even English, with cultures that include punk, hip hop, prep, and even Native American. But ultimately, what's often overlooked is the Japanese angle to nearly all of those influences. Take a criminally underrated label like Double Taps, for example. Many of you know that this label was started by Tetsu Nishiyama. Double Taps proposed a design language based on military and utilitarian elements, but in the ultimate show of Japaneseness, it has clearly defined silhouettes that are wider and more open. It's one of the highest quality street labels you could ever find, and yet because of its relative quiet position in the market, it's overlooked, and by virtue, underrated. In the West, we enjoy being told what brands are hot, who's wearing what, and what's gonna make you stand out. I say we because I am a Westerner that lives in Japan. But in Japan, that's a bit different. While Japanese certainly have their trends, they tend to settle in on a look far sooner than, say, young Americans. As such, the Japanese, much like Europeans, are more inclined to go out and discover new brands and designers, and as a result, fashion isn't as centralized. Labels that one might think are massively popular from Japan simply aren't. Bape comes to mind in that regard. You know how I talk about it. Seeing Bape on the street isn't rare, but compared to, say, the individuals who wear vintage or used clothing, and it isn't even close, it's vintage by a long shot. However, recent favorites from the Western perspective, like Capital and Needles, showcase this enigma as well. It's easy to like these labels because your favorite influencer or YouTube personality wears them and think that they're incredibly popular in Japan, but how did those individuals find it? It wasn't just being in Japan and they were popular, it was discovery and taking a chance, like the Japanese often do. And discovery is required to truly involve yourself in what Japan has to offer. You have to take those chances. Labels like Atto, for instance, may be incredibly desirable to an individual who wants to explore a more interesting cut to the contemporary. Or if that goes too far, Kazuyuki Kumagai. Black Means, an underground fan favorite, is incredibly popular for those who know, not because of who wears it, but the reputation it has for not only making daring pieces, but having well-made, daring artisanal pieces. From a Western perspective, quite often, the only viable brands are the ones that we know about or that are being talked about. But in Japan, True fashion prowess is finding labels that are well made that no one talks about that fit your aesthetic. It's like goros, right? Many of you know about goros. It's immensely popular for Westerners and Japanese alike. But Gem Homemade, Harem, and Rooster King all offer something in the same window, but with different takes. But can you guess how many people from the West will call you out for wearing those labels instead, as opposed to the more popular Ngoros? It happens more often than you think. And this is because Japanese fashion philosophy is not only in what's popular, and that may take Westerners through a loop. And it's not a knock on you to find a lesser known label that uses similar methodology, but in a different way. In fact, quite often it's applauded. To that end, Japanese fashion is much slower. Trends are slower, adoption is slower, and exploration is slower. It's a process. Like magazines are still a viable source of information here. And styles aren't blasted in your face every 2 seconds on TikTok or Instagram. Sure, that exists, but it's not as frequent. Just take a look at the Drop Tokyo's Instagram and you can see that styles are far more intense and personal than simply what's hot. Because of this, there are far too many subcultures for any one style to take root as definitive. Take hip hop culture, for instance, which has clearly catapulted fashion in the West to great heights. In Japan, hip hop styles exist, but many of them are older Gen X styles, fleshed out with a Japanese aesthetic, which basically means that current hip hop styles that are available in the West, or at least marketed by hip hop, have little effect on Japan outside of those who follow it. Think about ready-made, human-made, and of course Bape can attribute to this, all labels that were immensely popular before they even hit the Western market. And while there are those who appreciate Japanese fashion for its deeper well of styles, labels, and that it's not as affected by Western trends as in the West, succinctly, Japanese fashion is underrated because people have avoided talking about it, foregoing sharing the wealth of what they know for fear of the weeb label they desperately try to avoid, or becoming some type of Japanophile who's obsessed with only things in Japan. Capital, for instance, had a small shine in the late 2000s and early 2010s, but when more people of import wore it, it became more acceptable. Now the overall look and style of it is quite common, but years prior, you'd get laughed out of the building, a prospect that many aren't willing to subject themselves to. That is, Japanese fashion doesn't always operate based on visibility, like in the West, and therefore the best stuff requires a bit of fashion bravery. Not necessarily the best stuff, but the most experimental stuff, which Japan hangs its hat on. But it works in Japan, and only a few other places like Korea, Hong Kong, and parts of Europe. But the biggest market, America, the United States in particular, Japanese fashion will probably continue to be an underdog as long as it remains out of the spotlight. Also sizing, can't really neglect that point. Or until more people are able to buy into the philosophy, which is basically commitment to a look and going beyond that commitment. And that's a partial reason why Japanese fashion is so underrated, but not the whole reason. So I hand it off to you. Expand on it. Do you believe Japanese fashion is underrated, overrated, or properly rated? Let your thoughts be known in the comments. But most importantly, keep it locked right here for all of your info on international fashion, culture, and business from Tokyo. It's your boy, and keep it casual. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. And I'll see you guys in a minute.